It is the early hours of October 23, 1942, and a German reconnaissance pilot is climbing over the western desert south of El Alamein. Below him, in the gray half-light, the sand stretches out flat and empty for mile after mile, broken only by the dark shapes of lorries, fuel dumps, and gun emplacements clustered in the south. He banks, photographs what he sees, and turns for home. Within hours, that photograph will sit on a desk in Rommel's headquarters, and an experienced staff officer will look at it and draw an entirely reasonable, entirely wrong conclusion. The main British attack, he will report, is coming from the south. In fact, at that very moment, over 1,000 real tanks are grinding forward in the north, their engines muffled, their silhouettes disguised as soft-skinned lorries, while dummy tanks built from canvas and plywood sit motionless in the south, exactly where the British want them to be seen. Within a week, the Eighth Army will break the Axis line at the Second Battle of El Alamein, and Winston Churchill will later call it, if not the end, then certainly the end of the beginning. None of it would have worked without an extraordinary half-improvised British deception machine that had spent 2 years learning how to make armies disappear, and how to make empty desert look like an army. This is the story of how that trick was built and how it helped change the course of the war. To understand why Britain needed this kind of deception, you have to understand the desert itself and the shape of the war being fought across it. From 1940 onwards, British and Commonwealth forces in Egypt and Libya were fighting a campaign defined by enormous, featureless space. The western desert offered almost no natural cover. There were no forests to hide a convoy, no hills to mask an advance, no towns to break up a column of vehicles on the move. A tank, a lorry, or a gun, parked in the open, threw a shadow that a trained aerial observer could read from thousands of feet up, and the Luftwaffe and Italian air reconnaissance squadrons flew that desert daily. Worse, the British were chronically short of the very things that might have let them fight a conventional war of concealment. Equipment was scarce. Reinforcements arrived slowly from Britain by the long route around the Cape of Good Hope, and for long stretches of 1941 and 1942, the Axis forces under Erwin Rommel, soon nicknamed the Desert Fox, held the initiative and frequently outnumbered the British in tanks at the point of contact. The problem was not simply that Britain had fewer resources, it was that the desert offered no way to disguise that fact. Every lorry park, every fuel dump, every gathering of troops for an offensive was visible from the air with almost laboratory clarity, which meant Rommel's intelligence staff could, in theory, count every tank Britain possessed and predict every move before it was made. By 1941, it had become clear that conventional camouflage, the kind of static netting and paint schemes used on the Western Front a generation earlier, was simply not equal to this problem. Hiding a single tank under a net might fool a pilot at high altitude on a quiet day. It did nothing to hide an entire armored division being assembled for an offensive, and it certainly did nothing to disguise the fact that when an attack was coming, the buildup of vehicles, fuel, and ammunition in one sector was unmistakable from above, however well each individual vehicle was covered. There was also the matter of scale. A division preparing for a major offensive did not move quietly. It required hundreds of lorries to bring forward fuel, food, and ammunition, gun positions to be surveyed and dug, and tanks to be brought up from depots far to the rear, often along the same handful of coastal roads and desert tracks that any reconnaissance pilot would naturally photograph as a matter of routine. Every one of those preparations left a signature, and a competent enemy intelligence officer did not need to see a single tank to deduce that an attack was coming. He needed only to notice that traffic on a particular stretch of road had increased, or that a stretch of empty desert now showed dozens of fresh vehicle tracks where the week before there had been none. The British High Command faced an almost paradoxical challenge. They needed to move and mass enormous quantities of men and machinery in full view of an enemy who controlled much of the sky above them, and somehow have that enemy either not notice or, worse for Rommel, notice the wrong thing entirely. Earlier attempts at desert deception, going back to General Archibald Wavell's offensives in 1940 and 1941, had shown the basic idea had promise. Dummy tanks and guns, simple wooden frames, or inflatable shapes had been used with some success to suggest forces existed where they did not, and Rommel himself was known to have been wrong-footed by smaller deceptions earlier in the campaign.
But these early efforts were small in scale and often crude in execution, the kind of thing that might survive a glance from 5,000 feet, but would not survive the close, repeated photographic study that a major German offensive or a major British one would inevitably attract. Simply concealing the truth was not enough. The truth needed to be replaced with a convincing lie, on a desert-wide scale, sustained over weeks, and robust enough to survive close aerial photography taken on multiple passes, in different light, by experienced interpreters who had years of practice reading the desert from above. Nothing in standard military doctrine offered an answer to that. It would take an unusual mixture of soldiers, engineers, and, almost by accident, theatrical professionals to invent one. And it would take the discipline to apply their methods not to a single tank or a single gun, but to an entire army. That mixture coalesced into what became known simply as the camouflage unit, formed in the Middle East under an officer named Jeffrey Barkas, a former film director who brought a director's eye for what an audience, in this case a German pilot or photo interpreter, would actually believe. Barkas assembled a strange and effective team of artists, set designers, sculptors, and engineers, men whose peacetime skills in building convincing illusions for stage and screen turned out to translate with startling precision into building convincing illusions for war. Among them, attached to deception work for British military intelligence, was Jasper Maskelyne, a well-known stage illusionist from a London theatrical family, whose involvement in some of the unit's more celebrated schemes has since been debated by historians, with some crediting him as a driving creative force, and others arguing his post-war memoir overstated his personal role. What is well documented, however, is the unit's output, and the device that made the entire 1942 deception scheme possible was something called the Sunshield. The Sunshield was, at its heart, a lightweight frame of wood and canvas built to slip over a real tank and make it look from above and from a distance exactly like an ordinary 3-ton lorry. Picture a tent frame roughly the size and shape of a transport lorry's canvas tilt, but engineered to be dropped over a Grant or Sherman tank's turret and hull in a matter of minutes, disguising its tracks, its gun, and its low armored silhouette beneath the high, boxy profile of a soft-skinned vehicle. Hundreds of these were manufactured in workshops in Egypt, built from timber framing and painted canvas designed to match the color and texture of military transport seen from the air, and they weighed little enough that 2 or 3 men could fit one to a tank without machinery. Crews practiced fitting and removing the frames until the process took only a few minutes, since the entire scheme depended on tanks being able to shed their disguise quickly once the moment came to fight. The frame sat clear of the turret on a simple wooden lattice, tall enough at the front to suggest the high cab of a lorry, and sloping back towards the rear in a shape that, from directly above, broke up the tank's distinctive low, tracked outline into something closer to the rectangular shadow of a wheeled vehicle. The genius of the design lay not in any single clever mechanism, but in its understanding of how aerial reconnaissance actually worked. A photo interpreter studying thousands of square miles of desert was not examining each vehicle in forensic detail. He was looking for shapes, patterns, and shadows that matched known categories: tank, lorry, gun, supply dump. The Sunshield did not need to fool a man standing beside the tank. It needed to fool a trained eye glancing at a grainy photograph taken from several thousand feet. And at that distance, the difference between a tank silhouette and a lorry silhouette was precisely the difference the Sunshield was built to erase. Much the same logic applied to a companion device built to do the reverse job, taking an ordinary lorry and making it appear, at a glance, to be a tank, useful for thickening out a dummy formation with vehicles that could at least move under their own power and leave plausible tracks, rather than relying solely on static wood and canvas shapes that could never be repositioned convincingly. The manufacturing effort behind this scheme was itself considerable, run out of camouflage workshops and training establishments set up in Egypt, including a dedicated camouflage training center at Helwan, south of Cairo, where designs were tested, refined, and then produced in the hundreds needed to disguise an entire armored strike force. Exact production figures remain difficult to pin down with confidence, since record-keeping for what was, by its nature, a secret and improvised program was patchy,
and many of the specific quantities cited in post-war popular accounts cannot be fully verified against surviving official documents. What is clear from photographic evidence and the testimony of those who served in the unit is that the scale of production was sufficient to disguise the bulk of an armored division's tank strength, numbering well into the hundreds of vehicles, and to build a separate force of dummy tanks and guns in the thousands rather than the dozens. An industrial undertaking for what was, on paper, simply a camouflage section attached to Army headquarters. The wider deception, codenamed Operation Bertram, used the sunshield as one tool among several, deployed with a logic that today reads almost like stagecraft. In the weeks before the attack, roughly 1,000 real tanks of the 8th Army's armored divisions were moved up to their northern starting positions and immediately disguised as lorries using sunshields, so that German reconnaissance, day after day, photographed what appeared to be a routine and unremarkable buildup of transport rather than an armored strike force. At the same time, in the southern sector, where Rommel's staff expected and half anticipated a British attack, Barkas's team built more than 2,000 dummy tanks and guns from canvas, wood, and petrol tins, arranged in dispersed, realistic-looking formations to suggest a massing armored force that did not actually exist. Engineers dragged weighted devices behind real vehicles to fake the track marks a tank convoy would leave, and erased the genuine tracks left by tanks slipping north under their sunshield disguises, so the ground itself told the same false story as the photographs taken above it. A dummy pipeline, complete with fake pumping stations built to be assembled at a rate that matched the pace of a real construction project, was laid southward to suggest that water supplies, and therefore an offensive, were being prepared in that direction, timed so that German intelligence, watching its apparent progress day by day, would conclude the southern attack could not be ready until early November, days after the real attack in the north was actually launched. The pipeline trick alone is a small masterpiece of patience, since building it convincingly meant resisting the obvious temptation to finish it quickly and instead advancing the dummy construction only a few hundred yards each day, exactly as a genuine engineering project constrained by real labor and real material shortages would have done. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The deception was sustained, where possible, with sound and signal as well as sight. Dummy radio traffic was generated to suggest the routine chatter of a force readying itself in the south, while the genuine armored divisions massing in the north under their disguises maintained as close to normal wireless silence and pattern as could be managed, so that German signals intelligence, listening for the electronic signature of an impending attack, heard it apparently coming from the wrong place. Exactly how much of this Rommel's own staff fully believed, and how much was confirmed independently through other intelligence failures on the German side, remains debated by historians, and the surviving documentary record from German sources is thinner than the British accounts of building the deception, partly because so much of the success can only be measured by what the enemy failed to do rather than by a clear paper trail of what they wrongly believed. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Rommel himself was in Germany on medical leave when the attack began on the night of October 23, 1942, and the senior commander left in temporary charge, General Georg Stumm, died of a heart attack while inspecting the front within the first day of the battle, a chaotic start for the defending side that the deception plan can claim no credit for, but which compounded an Axis command structure that had already, by most accounts, misjudged where and when the blow would fall. It is worth setting this single, spectacular use of the deception machinery against what the Germans themselves were doing, because the contrast tells you something about why the British approach worked. German forces in North Africa employed their own camouflage and decoy methods, painting vehicles and dispersing supply dumps, The material impact of Operation Bertram on the battle itself is something historians are careful to discuss with appropriate caution, because deception, by its nature, leaves few documents behind that say plainly, "This fooled us, and we therefore made the wrong decision." What can be said with confidence is that the Eighth Army achieved a high degree of tactical surprise as to the exact location and weight of its main attack, that German reserves were initially positioned in a way that reflected genuine uncertainty about where the blow would land, and that the battle, fought over 12 days from October 23 to November 11, 1942, ended in a clear Axis defeat and a long retreat westward that never fully stabilized. Whether the deception scheme alone tipped a battle that British material superiority in tanks and artillery would likely have won regardless is a question that cannot be answered with certainty, and serious historians differ on how much weight to give it. What is harder to dispute is the psychological value the deception program had for the British and Commonwealth forces involved, and for Allied planners watching from further afield, because it proved, concretely, that a numerically and materially stronger enemy reconnaissance effort could be turned against itself, and that an army without the resources to win a battle of pure firepower could still shape what its enemy believed to be true. That lesson, learned painfully and improvised piece by piece across the sands of Egypt and Libya, would be carried forward by many of the same officers into the much larger deception operations of 1943 and 1944, making the Western Desert not just a battlefield, but something closer to a proving ground for the entire discipline of operational deception that the Allies would rely on for the rest of the war. A small number of sunshield frames and examples of the dummy equipment used in the desert survive today in collections such as the Tank Museum at Bovington, alongside photographs and Barkas's own post-war account of the camouflage unit's work. Return, for a moment, to that German reconnaissance pilot, climbing over the desert in the dark hours before dawn on October 23, 1942. He saw lorries where there were tanks. He saw an army gathering in the south that existed only as canvas, plywood, and painted petrol tins. He saw, in short, exactly what a small group of British soldiers, engineers, and theatrical designers had built for him to see, and he reported it faithfully because there was nothing in the photograph to suggest he should not. That is the entire trick, stripped to its essentials. Not invisibility, not magic, but the patient, disciplined construction of a false picture so complete that the truth had nowhere left to hide inside it. A tank became a lorry with a frame of timber and a sheet of painted canvas. An empty stretch of sand became an armored division with 2,000 dummy hulls and a few hundred dispersed campfires. A construction project that did not need to exist was built slowly enough and visibly enough to convince an enemy staff officer it was real. None of it required new physics or secret chemistry. It required only an unusually clear understanding of what the enemy could see, what the enemy expected to see, and the discipline to give him a story instead of a fact. Rommel, by most accounts the finest tactical commander either side produced in that desert war, was not beaten in October 1942 because his tanks were worse or his men less brave. He was beaten in part because for a handful of crucial days he and his staff were looking at the right desert and drawing entirely the wrong picture from it. The lorries that were tanks rolled north in the darkness. The tanks that were never there waited patiently in the south, exactly where they were supposed to be seen. And somewhere over the sand, a camera shutter clicked and recorded with perfect technical accuracy a lie.